Hello everybody, this is Justin with Shock Therapy again, and we are here today to show you how to install a dual rate spring kit on a Wildcat XX. Maybe you're considering a spring kit from us, maybe you've already purchased a spring kit. Either way, we'll show you how to put it on and how easy it is. So to my left is a complete dual rate spring kit from us. When you get these in the box, they're going to be tagged front upper, front lower, rear upper, and rear lower. That way you know where the springs go on the car. But one thing that we can't do is give you the part number of each one that you're going to get. The reason is that we tailor all of our spring kits to you, your accessories, your weight, driving style, and your terrain. So we change these rates on every single spring kit that we sell. You might get a little bit stiffer upper than your friend. Your friend might get a little bit softer lower than you did. The likelihood of you getting the exact same spring kit as your friend is fairly low. So the first step in the process of installing the springs is to bring your car into a flat surface in the garage or wherever you might be able to use it and jack the front of the car up. We want you to jack the car up to where the tire just barely leaves the ground. If you've got about a ½ an inch of gap there, that's about perfect. You'll realize that soon when we start to take the shock off and put the shock back on. It's a lot easier if you have it that high off the ground. You're able to wedge your feet underneath the tire and lift the tire a little bit to get the bolts to start. Once the tires are off the ground, you're going to remove the lower shock hardware, attaching it to the upper control arm. The next thing that you're going to do is remove the upper shock bolt, attaching it to the frame. The shock will remove very easily from the car, and there is no difference between the left side and the right side shocks in the front. The reservoirs are clocked in the same position, left to right, so if you mix it up, you're okay. Once you have the shocks removed from the car, you're going to lower the bump stop on the shock shaft down at least 2 or 3 inches. This will allow you to pull the spring retainer completely out of the way once the springs are compressed. Now our spring compressor is a pretty decent unit and it makes it easy to do our job, but if you end up doing this with ratchet straps or with a spring compressor from the local auto parts store, be careful so that you don't lose the spring and have it come up and get you in the hand or in the face. Once the springs are removed from the shock, take a moment to unlock the factory crossover rings. They're threaded and they're just jammed together, so grab a standard screwdriver and a hammer and break those loose. Once the crossover rings are loose, then do the same thing to the preload collars by breaking them loose with a standard screwdriver and hammer. With the shock on the bench, set the secondary rate nuts to 5½ inches to the bottom of the secondary rate nut. We are measuring from the bottom of the shock bridge. There is a small hump at the bottom of the bridge that we butt the tape measure against. Set your preload collar to 1 3/8 of an inch, and this is set to the bottom of the preload collar at the plastic isolator shown here. With your preload collar and secondary rate nut set, put the shock back in your vise and get ready to install the spring kit. Before you install the springs, take a moment to tighten the crossover rings against each other, exactly like they were with the stock springs in place before you loosen them. So grabbing the upper front spring of our kit, install it on the shock, sliding it over the crossover rings and all the way against the preload collars. Install the plastic spring divider that was on the shock originally with the long end facing the bottom of the shock, which in this picture is upward. Line the springs up to where the end of one spring hits the plastic divider on one side and the end of the other spring hits the plastic divider on the opposite side. You want the spring ends to not line up perfectly with each other on the plastic divider, but instead you want them to line up on opposite sides of the spring divider. This keeps the divider perfectly straight on the shock and it keeps the springs from bowing one direction or the other. Compress the spring system with your spring compressor and install the lower spring retainer in the same manner that you removed it. Release the spring tension slowly while you line up the spring divider so that it is in perfect position with the lower loop of the shock. Once this has been done, you can take this shock and install it on the car with the hardware holding it to the frame and the lower control arm left loose. When installing the shock back on the car, it takes a little bit of effort to line up the upper mount and get the bolt started. Remember to leave the hardware loose. Using your feet to raise the tire slightly, you'll find that it's a lot easier to start the bolt through the arm and the shock by moving the arm up and down with your feet underneath the tire. With the front shocks installed, proceed to the rear of the car. Jack the car up to where the tires are barely off the ground. You will need to remove the rear wheels and tires to get access to the lower shock bolts. Make sure that before you remove the lower shock bolt, you install a jack stand underneath the trailing arm. This way, when you pull the bolt out, the trailing arm can sit on the jack without overextending the axle. With the lower bolt removed, proceed to the upper bolt. Remove it and pull the shock from the vehicle. With the shock in the vise, remove the lower bump stop by sliding it down the shock shaft at least 2 to 3 inches so that you can remove the lower spring perch. Compress the springs with the spring compressor of your choice, removing the lower spring perch. Release tension and remove the stock springs and plastic divider. With the springs removed and the shock still in the vise, break the crossover rings loose and also break the preload collars loose with a standard screwdriver and a hammer. With the rear shock on the bench, measure down from the base of the bridge, butt the tape measure up against the hump on the bottom of the bridge and lower the crossover rings to 7.5 inches, measured to the bottom of the lower crossover ring. Adjust the preload collars to 4 3/4 of an inch. That is measured to the bottom of the preload collar at the plastic isolator. This is the same place that the coil spring rides. Take your rear shock and reinstall it in the vise. Grab a screwdriver and hammer and lock your secondary rate nuts in place. Grab the upper rear spring and install. Next, install the plastic spring divider with the long portion facing the bottom of the shock. Since our shock is upside down in the vise, this means that the long end of the divider is facing upward. Install the lower spring, making sure that the ends of the springs touch the plastic divider on opposite sides. Compress the spring system so that you can install the lower spring perch. Install the spring perch and release tension on the springs slowly so that you can line up the recessed portion of the spring collar. Now you can install the shock on the back of the car. Reinstall the shock on the back of the car by installing the upper shock bolt first. The easiest way to do this is to put the shock up in the upper shock mount position and drop the lower into the control arm before you install the bolt. With the upper shock bolt in place, install the lower shock bolt. Remove the jack so that you can move the control arm up and down to line up the hardware. Make sure that the bolt sleeve remains in the control arm on the inside position. Do not push the sleeve all the way through. Make sure that the bolt goes through the sleeve and the sleeve remains in the arm. Install all of your hardware, but keep it loose. This will allow us to adjust ride heights at a later time much easier. Now install the tires to the back of the car with all the lug nuts completely tight. Drop the car on the ground and then hop in to settle the suspension. You cannot jump up and down on the car and expect that the suspension will settle properly for the ride height adjustment. You need to drive the car, preferably around the block and back to a flat spot. If you don't have the space to drive it around the block, Then drive it forward and backward multiple times, hitting the brakes and hitting the gas to try and get the car to settle itself. Once you've done this, come to your last stop slowly without hitting the brakes so that the car does not take a weird set. With the driver of the car remaining in the car at all times, measure from the bottom of the car to the ground in the front, right at the firewall area behind the lower control arm mounts. This measurement should be around 15.5 inches. In the rear, measure from the lower frame tube underneath the transmission, from the bottom of that tube to the ground. We're looking for the rear ride height to be about 15 inches. If you had measured the car and it's sitting a little bit low and you want to raise the car up to the specs that we're asking for, which would be about a 15-inch ride height in the rear and a 15.5-inch ride height in the front with someone sitting in the car, you're going to do this one of two ways. You can take the shocks right back off the car and you can adjust the preload collar by lowering it to raise the car, or raising the preload collar to lower the car, and do this on the bench and put it back on the car. Or you can do it on the car with a spanner wrench. The only negative to using a spanner wrench to adjust this preload collar is that there's very little room. Spanner wrench is going to take you a long time, and it might actually be a lot faster just to pull the shock off, do it on the vise, and put it back on the car. Now that your ride height is set, and while you are still sitting in the car, measure the distance that the crossover ring is above the plastic spring divider on the shock. You're going to be measuring from the bottom of the crossover ring to the top of the plastic divider. These two surfaces are what contact each other as you compress the system. In the rear of the car, we're looking for 2 inches of gap between the crossover and the plastic divider, and on the front shocks, we're looking for 1 inch of gap. Remember, this is with you in the car. The reason that we have 1 inch in the front and 2 inch in the back is because when you get in the car and accelerate, the front will raise, the back will squat slightly, and you'll end up with about 1.5 inches of gap front and rear. The crossover rings affect the ride quality in multiple ways. If you were to lower the crossover rings on the system, which would allow the crossover to engage the lower spring earlier, the lower spring is stiffer. So by lowering the crossover ring from a tuning aspect, you're going to diminish your plush ride quality and gain stiffness sooner. If you lower the crossover ring, you'll gain bump stage. The car won't bottom out as easy. But if you lower it too far, it can actually get into the spring early, which will pick up too much spring rate and cause the car to buck. So if you want to tune those to try and bring them into the type of driving style that you have, feel free. But if you lower them too far, you'll start to pick up a buck. Go right back to where you used to be. If you raise the crossover ring, you're basically increasing the amount of time the system can be plush. There's no negative to this if you like a plush ride, but if you raise them too far, they will never engage the lower spring and you could easily bottom the car out. That's where you know that you've gone too high with the crossover. So bring it back down, start to engage a little bit sooner, and you'll stop all the bottoming that you might have gained. Now that you've gotten all the ride heights set on your car with somebody sitting in it, it's a perfect time to go ahead and tighten up all the hardware for the shocks. All that hardware is 12 millimeter on this car, which is an 80 foot-pound torque rating. With all the hardware tightened on the car, you're pretty much done with the spring installation. Things to keep in mind with this spring installation and going forward as you drive the car are: ride height is a changing thing. Springs will settle, and these are all brand new, so they will take a set. Typical set on a spring set from us is going to be 100 to 300 miles of use. Now that you have everything set ride height and you drive it 200-300 miles, we want you to check ride height again. If the springs have settled just a bit, go ahead and adjust the ride height again. Lock it down and drive the car. That's about the only time you're going to see our springs settle. Other things that are going to affect ride height as you start driving your car are adding accessories. Most people don't even realize how much weight they add to the car as they own it. They bolt on an air cleaner or bolt on a little accessory here and there, more beer in the cooler. Those things add up, and pretty soon 100 or 200 pounds of constant weight on the car is going to lower it. So it's a really good idea that you take your car every 200 to 300 miles and double check ride heights again. As you add accessories and lower the car, you need to maintain your ride height by adjusting it back up. Now, you wouldn't even think about it, but 50 to 100 pounds of accessories are going to drastically change the ride height in the car. Our spring kits are tailored to what you have given us for accessories, and if it's changed a little bit, that'll affect it. You start adding accessories and lowering the car, it's going to bottom out easier. You start removing accessories, which raises the car, it's going to ride stiffer. So maintain the ride height that we ask you to do, monitor it on a regular basis, and the car will always ride amazing. Another thing to consider when adjusting ride height is your tire size. You may not be running a stock size tire on your Wildcat. You might have a 31, 32, or larger size tire. For every 2 inches of tire height taller than a stock tire, your ground clearance will raise by 1 inch. So, if we're looking for about a 15-inch ride height with a stock factory tire, we're going to look for about a 16-inch ride height with 32-inch tires on the car. So consider what you have for tires, measure them with a tape measure to confirm that they actually are the height that they tell you that they are, and adjust the ride height that we're asking you to do accordingly. Another thing you're going to need to know is how to adjust your car once everything is installed and you go to drive it. With ride height set, crossover ring set as a basic adjustment, you're then going to adjust the compression clicker on the car. Now that adjuster is at the top of the shock, right at the bridge for the reservoir. The factory shock on this car has a 3-position adjuster, soft, medium, and hard. We would prefer that you start with your car with all of the adjusters set soft. That's the most plush ride quality that you can get. It also might be a little bit too soft if you drive aggressively. So the process we'd like to see you follow is to drive the car with everything soft, and if you can bottom the car out through normal driving, turn it up 1 click. So for instance, if you get into a washout and the back of the car drags the skid plate as you go through the washout, turn the rear clicker up 1 click and go right back through the same washout. If it doesn't bottom out, leave it. That's the most plush ride you can get while the system is adjusted for the way you drive. If it still bottoms out, turn the clicker up a little bit more to maybe the hard setting. If it doesn't bottom out, leave it. We want you to enjoy the most plush ride you can get while still having the proper amount of resistance to keep you from bottoming the car out on a regular basis. This spring kit should give you multiple advantages over the stock system. It will give you more resistance in bottoming out situations, or basically bump stage, jump landings, G-outs, washouts, anything that requires the suspension to soak up the complete weight of the car on a big hit. These springs are going to give you more support so that the car does not bottom out. At the same time, they will not sacrifice any of the plush ride qualities that the XX is known for. Our goal is to have both, if at all possible, and this spring kit will do that. Another key point with our spring kit is that the springs are warranted for life. If you have any issues with the spring, let us know, it's a free replacement. Also, the springs will only settle 1 time and they'll remain that way for the rest of their life. Unlike the stock springs, which tend to settle over the whole life of the spring, and you can never keep up with that. Our springs will settle 1 time, you can adjust it, and you'll have the peace of mind knowing that it's going to support you and your driving style for the rest of the time you own them. So that's it. We hope that the installation went well for you. If you have any more questions on tuning these springs or in general, leave those questions below. We'll get to them as soon as we can. If you want a faster response, give us a call at the shop and we'll answer anything you have.